Welcome, everybody. I'm really thrilled to be here to talk about Christine's book. I just thought I'd show you this because this is how
done her homework.
interested I was in this book. I'm not going to be reading every single excerpt from it, you'll be pleased to hear. But I kept running out of colours. So, I was just, at every page I was like, wow, this is so interesting. So, yeah, I mean, for me, having covered these issues for so many years, this was an absolutely fascinating book for me to read because I think as a journalist, you, to a large extent, feel on the outside of all these issues. And so for me, it was just wonderful, and you do it so well, Christine, to have this story told from the inside of the big corporations that I'm not normally ever allowed to go in and examine at that sort of level of depth. Mm-hmm. The other thing that you did really well, as a corporate idealist, you bring in all these other corporate idealists sort of later in the book as well. Yeah. And Christine's kind of created with the book a kind of amazing community of people. And for me, it was really wonderful because actually a lot of these people I've interviewed over the years, and it was wonderful to kind of reconnect with these people through your book. So I just, thank you for that.
Sarah, it was fun for me too to do all these interviews because a lot of them were people who I'd known for a long time. Professionally, we all go to the same conferences, but I'd never actually gotten to talk to them about how they feel.
Yes.
About their work and their ups and downs and their struggles and when their companies just deeply disappointed them.
Yes,
and what that was like. So it was good fun for me too.
Well, on that point, there's a really good line right at the beginning that I'll just read because it speaks very much to that point. This is in the introduction, and Christine writes, "We believe that business can be a force for good even as we struggle with our own contradictions." And I think that's a theme that runs through the whole book and is very sort of powerfully expressed. But I thought I'd start by, let's go back to the beginning.
Yeah.
Because you describe your relationship with BP and the corporate world as something of a love affair. And of course it was a love affair that was going to sort of fall apart after the Deepwater Horizon took place. But just tell us how that love affair started. I mean, what was the spark that made you think that, gosh, business might actually be a force for good in the world?
Right, okay, that's good, Sarah. That's a good place to start. So I had done nonprofit and government work and then decided to go to business school. First of all, like every good liberal arts graduate. But then also I realized that in these jobs, I seemed to be reacting to things that the private sector had done. So when I was doing community service, when I was working in the New York City mayor's office, we were reacting to the conditions that business had created. So I was serving in communities that had been devastated when companies had moved out or they had actively done things bad, like they had lobbied to replace a public garden with a parking lot, or they had moved into an area and failed to hire anybody from that city. And then in the mayor's office, on the flip side, companies were wooed for the jobs and for the revenue that they bring in. And so there was always this sort of balance of, okay, well, we clearly need to regulate business, but we want to encourage them.
Right.
So that's why I chose to go to business school, because I thought, okay, business actually seems to be pretty important in the world. I should learn something about the private sector. So I went, but of course I had no idea what I wanted to do. Did any of you go to business school? And so, you get there and people immediately start asking you to throw your resumes in for investment banking or consulting interviews. And you get there, you're like, I don't know what this is, and I haven't learned anything new. So I started to follow the herd and do that. But then John Browne, who at the time was the CEO of BP, came to speak at Yale. And he had recently become the first head of a major energy company to acknowledge the realities of climate change and urge action. And he was a really inspiring and thoughtful leader. And I thought, oh, this is what business can do. That is intriguing to me. So that's why I joined, because of this leader who seemed to be a different kind of oil man, trying to create a different kind of energy company.
Right.
And it was really intriguing. So I joined and I went straight out to Indonesia. And the thing that turned out to be my job in Indonesia and China was investing in the communities living near big BP projects, because everybody who I worked with realized that what was good for those communities was good for our business. There were lots of other terrible examples around the world of where community relations have gone sour and communities have blockaded access roads to mines, they've sabotaged equipment. So people seem to understand that what was good for them was good for us, and that was my job. So I was living this cliche of doing well and doing good. I mean, what's not to love?
And was this something that came up when you were at business school? I mean, were these kinds of issues? I mean, I know now, business schools have been, piling on the courses about sort of sustainability and corporate responsibility. But back then, was that something that was covered?
Yeah, not specifically. I mean, I chose to go to Yale for business school because its mission has always been to educate leaders for business and society. So there's always been this sort of ethos there of, yes, we go there in order to do some sort of service to the world. And people who go there choose to do it through business or working with business. But no, at the time, there weren't sort of corporate responsibility jobs or sustainability jobs.
Right. But then now, so, you've sort of not met John Browne, but seen him speak and kind of bought into this idea that BP could be a force for good. And then you're in a helicopter flying over the jungles of Indonesia. Now, what is going through your head at that point?
Right. So I went out to Indonesia. I spent my summer internship between my 2 years of business school and London headquarters. And then my first assignment with BP was out in Indonesia. But again, this wasn't a CSR job. I was supposed to be a commercial analyst using my new spreadsheet skills. And BP had just taken over ARCO, the American Oil Company. And so I was there. A lot of the ARCO stuff was in Indonesia. So I was analyzing those projects. There were lots of different, oil fields, gas fields. There was some coal, some solar, chemicals. What should BP keep? What should it spin off? What should it do with all this stuff? So I was just crunching numbers and doing spreadsheets because that's what you did when you graduated from business school. I didn't know that this was, a job, but one of those projects was proving particularly interesting. And not from a technical point of view. From a technical point of view, it was very straightforward. So there was a big gas field, and BP was going to build a plant, a liquefied natural gas LNG plant to process the gas. And that's pretty straightforward. BP's done that all over the world, but never in a place like this, where we were going to have to work with the Indonesian military, which is not known for their good community relations, and a village was going to have to be moved to make way for the plant of 127 families.
Not to mention the forest that you were flying over.
Exactly. So my first trip out there, and it was, I was living in Jakarta, in Indonesia's capital, and so to get out to West Papua, I had to take an overnight commercial flight, and then a little seaplane. It was like a 12-seater plane, another hour and a half, and then a helicopter the rest of the way in. So on that last leg of the journey, there's just really dense rainforest, sort of flocks of birds bursting through the trees, not a lot of people. And as we started to get closer, I could see the rig on the horizon in the bay. And as we were coming in, I could just see our landing pad and then the dormitories for the workers there. And, we were on the equator. It was pretty hot. I'd never been in a helicopter before. This was pretty exciting. But I was starting to get really, really just like sweaty and uncomfortable. And I realized that I was envisioning the sketches of what the plant was going to look like. And it was this gleaming modern industrial complex. And imposing it on this, not totally pristine, but relatively pristine rainforest. And I started to get really ill. I just thought for the first time, oh, this is what we do.
Not something they prepare you for at business school.
No, I understood conceptually, we keep the lights on and we help keep the cars moving. But that's when it really hit me. And so we landed, and you can't really talk in the helicopter because it's pretty loud. But I was there with one of the vice presidents for environmental policy, and she immediately saw the distress on my face. And she said, "That's why we're here. We're going to get this right."
Now, what does getting it right mean? Because there's I think it'd be interesting to talk a little bit about perceptions of business and how business operates and what the realities are on the ground, because I think I certainly get a sense, often in the people that I talk to that aren't in the business world, that they think, well, business is just this evil empire that comes in and lands and that's it. And the reality on the ground and the things that you were then going to deal with is sort of complex and messy.
Yes.
And how much of that is the company's responsibility, and how much are you dealing with the existing environment and having to sort of negotiate all these sort of very complex trade-offs?
Yeah, that's exactly the question. This company knows that, as well as anyone. And we can get into that certainly as well. So I guess the first fundamental macro concept is the point that energy does keep the lights on and helps enable the lifestyles that we want to lead. And so I suppose, there are plenty of people who want to try to stop globalization and stop development altogether. And that's fine. There should be some people who want to do that. I can get a little bit snarky with them and ask sort of, well, who keeps your lights on? And
right.
How did you get here today? And what made that possible?
We live part of the corporate world as consumers and individuals, don't we?
Exactly. I mean, one thing that I do once in a while is just a little game, which I invite you all to play with me, but just stop and take an inventory, right? I just stop and say, okay, head to toe, what am I wearing right now? And what's in my bag? And how many companies or brands, have I interacted with since I woke up this morning, right? So I've got a coffee maker and I've got my alarm clock and I woke up in my sheets that were made here and bought here. And I just go through, okay, well, what do I know about these companies? And where does that put me on the responsible to overconsumption
Right,
spectrum,
and I think
right?
what's interesting, and this is particularly true, I guess, of sort of apparel industries and food, which have very complex supply chains, but even with energy, you turn the lights on and you don't think about that Indonesian villager that had to move to another village or to a new village.
Yeah.
What were the real on the ground challenges that you didn't expect, and that certainly business school might not have prepared you for? Some of the sort of nitty gritty. I mean, you talked about sort of not. I think there was something you mentioned about the fact that this was really interesting to me, that you didn't have to. You made it so that the workers did not get paid on site.
Yeah, that's right.
That for me reflected a lot of the complexities that you're dealing with on the ground. So perhaps just explain
I can explain that. So we were building this big plant in a really remote area. There was one village there, but no other cities nearby. So we stipulated in the contract with the construction company that they would not hire or pay people on the site. They would only do that in one of the 3 existing towns that were a little ways away. The reason is that if you let it be known that you're going to be hiring people right at the site, people move right up to the fence. And then they usually, if they can't get a job because there aren't that many jobs, then they tap into the electricity. They stay there because they've moved. And that's how shanty towns pop up, and then, idle hands, right? So, and that's how bad things arise, because then also if you pay people on site, imagine if somebody's done a 3-week shift and then they stand there, they walk out of the plant and you hand them 3 weeks worth of cash and they're not home with their families yet. You might imagine what pops up. So then brothels pop up, sort of ad hoc, gambling parlors pop up. And then what happens? Then the police feel like they need to move in for protection, but they're actually taking their cut. And then the military step up their presence because they're like, wait a second, the police are getting in on all the action, right? So you can see how these things start to compound. So that's why we didn't want to hire
really
people.
So complex, isn't it, for so many industries? One of the things I thought would be interesting to ask you about was where you talk a lot in the book about CSR, and later we'll talk a little bit about sort of careers in CSR and how you move into that. Personally, I hate the term CSR. I don't know about you, because I think it sort of silos these things into some kind of acronym that half the world doesn't know what that means anyway. So where do you see the balance? A lot of companies will talk about their sustainability program or their business responsibility program, and then you find that they're talking about changing the light bulbs in the office or recycling things. What you've just described on the ground in Indonesia, to me, that's corporate responsibility.
Yes.
How do you see that sort of view in business, that attitude having shifted, or has it shifted?
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, the term corporate social responsibility sort of drives me crazy because it can mean everything and it can mean nothing. Right? So I definitely see the same thing. And I think that the benefit is that so many more companies are comfortable talking about that, whatever it is. So it actually gets them to the table, right? And so I have a nice quote in there from Aaron Kramer, who runs BSR, Business for Social Responsibility, and he says the trick is to get them to the table and then move the table. Right, so the point is to get more and more companies in talking about corporate social responsibility, talking about sustainability, so you get them into the conversation and then try to explain, okay, actually, this is what we're really talking about here. Right. We're not actually talking about sending out employees in matching t-shirts to go paint a wall for 5 hours a week. Like, that's great, as is recycling and as are these other programs, but that's actually not what we're talking about here. Right? We're talking about what are the impacts that your core business has on society. And I think here that's become clear as people have realized, the challenges to privacy and free expression that your core business has on the world and that you as a company have a responsibility to address. And the other stuff that you do is really interesting and it's really great and it's really important. But I would be fine if all the other stuff sort of fell away and companies put all of that time and energy and resource into their core business.
Right. Now, the challenge there, though, is that there are sort of perceptions of this costing money. And what's the pay? What is the payback for resettling an Indonesian villager? Just talk a little bit about working within a big corporation on these issues that are material to the business, or at least that you've explained very well in the book, are so material to the business. When there are you may be surrounded by the skeptics who go, well, why are we going to pay all this money for something that's on the other side of the world? And what are the challenges of being a corporate idealist, even within a company like BP, which at the time was really, as you say, trying to do the right thing?
Yeah, at the time it was on the projects that I worked on, but still, you need to justify your costs and how much you're spending. So I suppose in Indonesia, I had the mixed blessing of there being some really horrible examples nearby of how much this can actually cost a company when it goes really badly. So on the other end of Indonesia, in Aceh, there was a similar facility, a liquefied natural gas plant, that had to shut down for 4 months because of basically a civil war going on around it that some people accused that company of exacerbating. And I did some research for the book. I couldn't find an exact figure, but I found a bunch of estimates that said that shutdown, that 4-month shutdown, cost ExxonMobil anywhere from $100 to $350 million. Right? Even for Exxon, that's, it's kind of a lot of money. In the same province as the project that I worked on is the Freeport-McMoRan Grasberg copper and gold mine. It's one of the largest mines in the world. And they spent something like $42 million on security in 1 year. And that keeps going up because when they came in, they struck a deal with the national government. They didn't pay much attention to local community issues. And now they've realized that didn't work. But it's really hard to turn these things around once they've gone wrong. So I think in oil, gas, and mining, it's pretty clear now that you can't operate these projects well if you don't invest in these issues up front. And other industries are starting to see that too. In apparel, companies have realized that if you treat your workers better, they're going to be more productive, there'll be less turnover, so we're seeing that. And then in the tech sector too, I think the challenges to privacy and free expression demonstrate that you need the trust of users. Right, that's what your whole business is built on.
It's the license to operate.
It's the license to operate. That's exactly what it is.
Yeah.
And so you're right that still sometimes it's hard to demonstrate a very specific return on investment. So I think it's fine to have a rigorous debate about that. Well, do we need to spend this much, or can we spend this much? I'm not crazy about going too far down road. Because, for example, if I say, okay, well, I want to spend $11 million next year to make sure that our security arrangements are in line with international human rights principles so that we won't, be complicit in genocide, say.
Right.
I don't really want to have this conversation of saying, well, I don't know if we have 11 million. If we spend like 4 or 5 million, is there going to be a 60% chance that we're complicit in genocide? And it's like, okay, you know what? This is not, but seriously. I mean, you do have to have a little bit of that, but I think it's okay to call it out when it's ridiculous.
Right, sure, yes. But I guess and again, it's something you mentioned in the book, which I thought was very intriguing, is the whole idea that in this work that you're doing, even if you're not having to sort of measure dollar for dollar what the return is, you're essentially doing work to make something not happen.
Yes, and nobody gets rewarded for that, right? So one of the people who I interviewed manages supply chains for a really big company, and she said that one of their internal awards, which are really prestigious in a big company, went to one of her colleagues who managed a big safety disaster. And she was like, I prevented like 20 of those, right? But again, nobody gets rewarded for somebody that doesn't happen. And I have one of the people who I interviewed, Isabella Okovi, who runs the Business and Human Rights program at Yahoo. And she was brought in after Yahoo was compelled to turn over user information by the Chinese government for Shu Tao, a journalist who was then jailed. And she was brought in after that, but now it's been a while. There's been a lot of turnover at the company. And she said that part of the challenges of doing this work well is that if nothing goes wrong, then you get people sort of looking around and going, well, wait, what are you doing here?
Yes,
right?
yeah.
Why are you here
exist?
with all this budget, right? And she's like, I'm the one preventing the bad things from happening, but you don't always know that.
No, that's right. And those stories don't come out. I mean, one of the things that I think also this is a sort of topic quite close to my heart is the extent to which companies are or should be more open and honest about both their failings and their successes. I mean, people are always pitching me stories saying, "Oh, come on, we've just cut our carbon footprint by X million tons," and they don't want to tell me that the problem they had doing it. I think because there is this sort of very much the sort of corporate message that has to be controlled. But do you think that given what's going on, and I think this works sort of both ways because. That I think results in people not seeing the real story, and so they just see when the bad thing happens, they think, that's the rotten corporate sector again.
Right.
But by contrast, I mean, I was speaking to somebody the other day, and I was talking about what I write about, and she said, oh well, I try and do the right thing with business, and she said, I never buy anything from Nike. And I said, well, the company has changed, and actually it's now seen as a sort of gold standard in managing labour rights and things like that. So just how do you see the evolution of companies when it comes to sort of telling their own story about this stuff?
Yeah, you've totally hit the nail on the head, because one of the challenges of many of the people that I interviewed is, I assumed that it would be with their legal departments, because I had some challenges in BP of commissioning these human rights impact assessments that I then assumed that we would publish, and our legal department was like, oh no, can't talk about that. But actually a lot of people said that the challenges were in their communications departments, because they only want to tell good stories.
Right.
And that's a real challenge, because being open about your challenges is what, first of all, creates a more informed public conversation. Right? I mean, I think that Google and a lot of your other peer companies issuing transparency reports, right? Like issuing the challenges and the requests that you're getting from governments for censorship and for user data is really important, right? It helps convey to people like, okay, here's the scale of the problem, and maybe we should be turning our attention to governments as well. So I think it's really important, and I think, again, some companies are starting to come around to that, but it's still slow.
It's a challenge, and of course I think the danger is as well that you stick your head above the parapet, and then you get attacked. So I mean, I remember writing a piece years ago about GAP's corporate responsibility report, which was a sort of warts and all thing
Yeah.
where they listed all their suppliers and they, they highlighted where they had, incidents of child labour in their supply chain.
Yeah.
And while most NGOs and a lot of the press, the piece I wrote for the FT was sort of fairly balanced piece about why they were producing this report.
Yeah.
One, I remember coming home and watching a local news channel, and it just said huge abuses uncovered at GAP factories. And so, the danger, I guess, is that they misinterpret that story.
Well, that's right. But then what happened years later when that story came out about the GAP finding illegal, subcontracting, and there were some kids that were making GAP kids clothes. But that story, people stood up. People like Mary Robinson, the former president of Ireland, former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, and other NGOs standing up, defending the GAP, and saying, hey, the GAP has been working on these issues longer and harder than any other company. And frankly, if any company says that they've eradicated the problem of subcontracting, they're lying.
Right,
so the story kind of went away.
Yes,
So again, I think that's part of taking the long-term view.
Right. Honesty and openness builds your credibility, even if a few stragglers don't get it.
Exactly.
Yeah. One thing that another theme that comes very, very strongly through the book is the impact you're making as a corporate idealist in these companies. I don't know how you felt when you left your MBA and headed out hoping to change the corporate world entirely. But often there are battles one has to pick, and there are compromises to be made. What do you see as sort of the balance for you and others in this world of trying to achieve incremental change versus complete transformation? And are they both laudable objectives?
Yeah, I think they're both important, and frankly, that's the whole arc of the book, and what compelled me to write it in the first place is that I did come charging out of business school thinking I'm going to change the world and this is going to be awesome. And then my first few years with BP, I really felt like that. I was doing amazingly innovative and progressive and helpful work around these projects with the full backing of senior management. I thought this was amazing. And then working with colleagues around the world in BP who felt the same way, who were doing the same work. And then it was after the Deepwater Horizon disaster. I had left BP at that point.
Right.
But that, to me, was the real sort of crisis of confidence of that BP that emerged in the aftermath of that disaster, of this sort of reckless, callous, risk-taking company. It didn't at all resemble the BP that I thought I'd gotten to know so well over the 9 years that I'd been there. So my first reaction was, well, hang on, that's not my BP. And then my second reaction was, or was it? So I started talking to friends who've been doing similar work deep inside big companies for a long time, like friends who work in apparel companies after the Rana Plaza factory collapse in Bangladesh, who similarly thought, I've been doing really good supply chain work for 20 years and we just killed 1,100 people. So what does it really mean to do this work? So it started off as this personal journey of trying to understand, trying to reconcile those two BPs, and trying to understand the work that I had done there, and realizing that a lot of people doing this work in big companies have these similar challenges. And so what I came to, not to give away the punchline, but what I came to was, yes, if you're going to go work in a big, massive company, this work is really incremental, and it's not going to change overnight. But that doesn't undo good work, right? Again, as long as it's not like a carbon offset right? As long as it's not like, oh, I'm doing really good philanthropy for the company, but it's harming people with its core business. I really believe that the work that I was doing in Indonesia and China was exactly the kind of work that we want extractive companies doing, that we want them doing around these big projects that supply the world's energy. So there are moments for transformative change, right? When you can really move your company, like there are these moments, right? And you can really move your industry. Like, for example, Google's part of the Global Network Initiative, which is this really important initiative that it was part of creating with Microsoft, with Yahoo, with some socially responsible investors and some human rights groups and some academics to come up with a code of conduct to better protect free expression and privacy. And that's really important, and I think that's transformative. I mean, it's going to take a while. It's taking a while to implement. But still, that kind of thing is transformative. But the day-to-day work is much slower.
Right. Now, I mean, there are all these initiatives that you mention, and you know, a lot of in all kinds of industries there are collaborations to address labor abuses in factories, from to human rights to environmental collaborations. Is this enough? Where do we need to actually just turn to government to step in and start? You see, despite years of working on, despite examples like Nike, despite companies that have really worked on, supply chain issues in the apparel industry, we still have Rana Plaza. At what point do we have to say, business can't do this alone or can't be relied on? Do we need government to just set stronger rules?
We absolutely do. And so none of the things that I've talked about relieve government of their responsibility. I mean, if governments were fulfilling their responsibilities, we wouldn't kind of be having this conversation. I mean, we would. Right? There's no substitute for strong, smart, good, properly enforced regulation. But the problem, I think, is that when something bad happens with a company, the conversation seems to be, oh, there go those evil companies again, we need stronger regulation. And it's like, well, we've got a lot of regulation, like, how's that working out for us, right? And so to me, it's sort of like, if you're watching a basketball game and the basketball players start throwing punches and everybody's like, where are the refs? Where are the refs? Well, hang on, like, why are you letting the players off the hook? Right? Like, we can't just look at the refs. Like, we need the refs. The refs have to be there. So there is no substitute for strong, good regulation. But regulation takes a long time to pass, right? And the companies know better than anyone else what's going on inside. So that's the focus here. But I do talk a bit about the role of government, and no way should governments be let off the hook, nor should the rest of us, nor should consumers or investors.
Well, and in some ways it's companies' responsibility to engage with governments to develop the right kind of regulation that doesn't doesn't hinder business but does the right thing as well. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about life as a corporate idealist and how you get things done, because you didn't go in to be a CSR, you didn't join BP as a CSR person or a sustainability person. And we have lots of those people with lots of those titles, but is it the case that actually everybody can be a corporate idealist? And how do you do that from within a position where, I don't know, you're in operations management or HR or communications? What would you advise to people who would like to get involved in this but are not working in the CSR department?
Yeah, well, sometimes I think people can be in a position of greater power just by doing the functions that they're doing them and doing them well and thinking about the big picture. I mean, in China, I was on the construction team, right? Because our biggest risk there, I was sent out there to work on a BP.
Didn't know that you learned building when you were doing an MBA.
Who knew, right? That construction was my minor, but no. But I went out there because BP had a joint venture with Sinopec, one of China's state energy companies, to build a really big chemicals plant that was going to bring in tens of thousands of migrant workers into a town of about 30,000 people. So, it could be some impacts there. But so my first week there, I was in this meeting, and it was like half BP guys and half Sinopec guys, and we were going down the spreadsheet of the latest estimates for the cost and the timeline for the project. And there was one label in the spreadsheet where the number was 8, but the label hadn't been translated into English. And so my BP colleague said, "What's this? No, what's the number 8? What's the label?" And the guy said, a Sinopec guy said, that's the projected number of fatalities. He said, excuse me? And he said, yeah, based on a project this big with this many man hours, we would expect 8 fatalities. And my colleague said, the target is not 8. He said, the target is 0. And the Sinopec guy said, that's not realistic. And he said, if you set expectations that you're going to kill 8 people, you're probably going to kill at least 8 people. Mm. And the guy said, well, that's not realistic. And I realized that he was right. Based on their track record, it was probably realistic that they were going to kill 8 people. Mm-hmm. So that's the kind of conversation that I had to have there. Yeah. This was on the construction team,
yes.
right? So we managed not to kill anybody during, construction. Hooray! But but to make the case there, for example, it took me a while to figure out the right language to use, right? So I went in there saying, okay, we're going to protect the human rights of the workers and of communities. And, that didn't work so well. It just fell flat. I didn't get thrown out or anything, but it just didn't work. And then I tried, okay, these are the standards that BP uses for our projects around the world, and that's what we're going to use here. And it was like, get out of here. Like, that's incredibly arrogant, right? So I had to shut up for a couple weeks and just listen to what resonated, right? What are people motivated by? What drives them? Mm-hmm. And so finally I came back with, okay, I understand that you want this to be a world-class model project. And if that is the case, then these are the standards, these international standards on working conditions, these are the standards that world-class model projects use. And they were like, oh, okay, why don't you say so?
It's so true, isn't it? So many different parts of business have their own language.
Yes.
I remember talking to one person who I think was actually in the oil industry, and they were saying, take the word integrity. If you say the word integrity when you're standing in the CSR department, they probably think that you're talking about being honest and open and treating your workers right. And if you say integrity to an engineer, he means, well, is our oil pipe going to blow up?
Right.
So,
it's about process,
those language, those terms are very powerful. And I think, one of the things that comes out very strongly in your book is how you, as corporate idealists, how do you connect with the rest of the company?
Yeah.
But just to go sort of back to something I mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, how do you create your community as a corporate idealist? You mentioned, I think, going to, I think it was just after you'd had the twins, you mentioned you were determined to get to this BSR conference because you really needed to. And I think I remember meeting you there. You look great, by the way. But this sort of need to be with other people in your community.
Yeah,
how would you advise people to sort of try building those communities so that you don't feel such a sort of isolated person in this role?
I think now it's easier. Every company has sort of interest groups, and every company's got like a green team, and I think it's easier. And I think for outside of the company, there are CSR or sustainability meetups everywhere, right? So I think it's a lot easier. But I guess one thing that came through in a lot of these interviews, and again, there were people who I'd known professionally for a long time, but never talked to them about how they found their jobs in the first place. And one theme that certainly was true for me is that I did a lot of thinking out loud about what I was interested in, regardless of the job that I was doing, but what's our company's role in society, and what's going on over there, and you still have to be good at your job and focus on it, right? But for a lot of these people, again, they fell into these roles when corporate social responsibility, CSR, was not really a function. So like me, they fell into it because they were sort of asking lots of questions and talking to other people in their company about, well, here's sort of what I'm interested in. What are we doing on this? And what should we be doing? And shouldn't we be doing this? And I just saw a documentary last night and just read an article about this. And how do we react to that? So that when something opened up, right, people thought, oh, that person would be really good at this. Like, very rarely does a sort of job posting pop up on the board and it's like, oh, I should apply, and then you apply, right? That's
you end up doing things from within your existing job. That's and probably exactly doing that in your spare time until somebody comes along and says, hey, this is something we need in the company.
So I'm a big proponent of thinking out loud about the things that you're interested in. And I have found, certainly for me, that tends to create space for opportunities to arise.
What does that mean, though, for somebody who is thinking they would like to do this, but they're graduating from business school? And where do you start? I mean, you know, the jobs, as you say, the job that says CSR and sustainability could sort of mean anything. How do you go about that today?
Yeah, well, I suppose there are a few things. I mean, within business school, you know, there's Net Impact, which is the association, and every business school has a Net Impact chapter now, and they have their own job boards and things for specifically for these jobs. But I suppose when I get all of these inquiries of people saying, "Oh, I really want to get into this field," you know, I ask people, "What do you actually want to do all day?" Right? Do you want to be traipsing around villages? Do you want to be sitting behind a desk creating policies? So I guess like any job, you know, you break it down into, well, what are the skills that I want to be using all day? What are the issues that I really care about that I want to be working on? Are there particular countries that I'm really excited by, or geographies that I have a specialty in? And then, like anything, there's a little bit of serendipity in finding the right position with the right people at the right company open at the right time. But people talk about serendipity a lot, and I think we sort of give it too much weight.
You have to make your own opportunities
you have
in some
to make
ways.
it, because it drives me crazy. I mean, you guys hear a lot of people speak here, and I will bet you that whenever you hear illustrious people, you know, talk about their careers, inevitably there is always one moment, right, when they say, "And then I just got this call one day," right? You're like, there's some like knowing nods. "I just got this call out of the blue one day," and that's baloney, right? So when they say that, ask them to trace the call, because people don't offer jobs to somebody who they've never met before. People offer jobs to people who, "Oh, I was just, you know, playing squash with my friend, and he mentioned that his friend's daughter was looking for a job in this space," right? Or it's a conversation that you had with somebody 3 years ago, and something just opened up, right? I mean, you can't control the timing of these things, and that's where serendipity comes in. But I actually think it does a great disservice when people talk like that, when people say, "I just got the call out of the blue one day," because it makes you think that you're just supposed to sit back and wait for the call.
Whereas in fact it's a lot of asking questions, talking about the right things.
Exactly, and thinking out loud and building your networks.
Yeah. Well, on that note, actually, it's a good moment to see if anybody has any questions here for Christine.
So, CSR is very much like CSR is very much like inside the company. I'm going to try to fix a problem because we're a good company.
Yeah.
What can users, consumers do to push companies to change their practice?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think consumers have to ask, right? Users have to demand. And so I think, you know, in this sector, we saw that here where users are saying, well, hang on, why was this information taken down? Why am I getting different search results in this country than in that? I mean, I think users and consumers have to ask. But frankly, I've gotten really depressed with how little consumers demand, and you know, I cite some of these studies in the book of how people say that they will pay more for fair trade or sustainable products, but there are all these studies that show, you know, if you've got two piles of socks sitting next to each other and one's marked fair trade and one's marked not, people will buy the fair trade one if they're the same price, but as soon as you bump the price up, you know, people don't buy them, right? So there's a little bit of money where our mouth is, but I appreciate that that's really hard. But I think just asking the question. So one of the times when I did one of those head-to-toe, you know, inventories, and I realized that there were a couple of brands that I'm wearing that I didn't know anything about, I tweeted. I just said, "Hey, X brand, what's your, you know, policy in the wake of Rana Plaza?" Two of them didn't respond. And so, you know, I retweeted and I said, "Bummer, you're not responding. I'm not buying any more of your stuff." One of them, I posted something on their Facebook page, and they wrote this long, like, awesome response, right, of how, well, we try to establish long-term relationships with our suppliers, et cetera, et cetera. And, you know, I haven't, like, verified it yet, but I think it was a pretty awesome response, and there were lots of other people who liked the comment, right? So I think asking the questions, again, is really important. Like, we have to ask, and it makes the job of the people inside the company a lot easier to be able to say, look, this isn't my imagination, that this is important. So I have, well, there are a couple of interesting ways that I talk about this in the book. One of them, I interviewed a lot of advocates and activists. And again, they're people who I've known for a long time, but I'd never actually talked to them about their tactics and how they think about their work. So there were some human rights advocates that said, actually, we see our job as creating space inside the company for you to do your job better,
Right.
which was so interesting. And one other person inside a company said, you know, I used to have to call up quietly, you know, one of my NGO or socially responsible investor friends to say, you know, now would be a really good time for you to write a letter to my CEO. And you don't really have to do that anymore because, you know, they're a hashtag, right? Like, you don't need to do that anymore. But I think users and consumers absolutely have to ask.
And, you know, technology has made that so possible in a way that it never was before. I mean, you know, you can immediately contact a company and
exactly.
ask
On
them
Twitter
the
or on
question.
Facebook,
I mean, you know, years ago you had to write them a letter and it probably end up,
Right.
you know, in some backwater. And
Right, because nobody else ever saw that you wrote the letter.
right, exactly. So they didn't have to answer it.
Exactly,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
now, like, it's out there.
Yes,
Right.
it's all public. So yeah.
Yeah.
Another question.
Thanks so much for being here, first of all. Appreciate it. How do you deal with the, in my thought process is it must be very disheartening at times when you see something like BP oil spill happen,
Yeah.
and a couple of years on, zero conversation really happening about it. But you know, entire ecosystems were disintegrated, you know, by all accounts, I think, during that time period. So I guess for something like environmental issues or climate change, something that is kind of, we're on a ticking kind of clock, you know, versus something like labor rights, which might take that time, you know, from a policy level down to the grassroots.
Yeah.
How do you deal with something like the environment, and do you get disheartened? I guess I'm curious about that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, again, that's a lot of what compelled me to write the book, because it was after the Deepwater Horizon disaster. It was like, what is it? Like, what does it mean? Are we making any difference at all, or is this completely useless? So again, not to give away the punchline, but I don't think it's completely useless. But I think that all of us as individuals need to decide, what role do we want to play? Right? And so some of us need to be inside companies and fighting that incremental every day, like trying just to tweak some practices that take a long time. And some of us need to be shouting from the rooftops and being activists and protesting on the street. And, you know, obviously those roles have their frustrations too. But, you know, I do have faith that all of the people who are doing this work do believe that they're making a difference, right? And one of the themes that really came through loud and clear, which was, again, I didn't expect it, was the optimism of people who are doing this work. Like even, so one friend who's worked in supply chains for a number of apparel companies, he went on a visit to visit factories in India. And then the guy who was showing him around said, let me just take you to one factory that's not on your list. It supplies the domestic market, just to show you what it's like. And he walked in there. He said it was filthy. There was a 10-year-old kid on one of the machines. And it was horrible. And I said, well, what did that feel like to see that? And he said, well, it opened up this whole other question that I don't know what to do with, of what do we do with factories that are supplying the domestic market that aren't held to international standards? And he said, but actually, I left optimistic, because I thought if these were what the factories that do supply us looked like 20 or 30 years ago, you know, we have made a big difference. And it's that optimism that I saw over and over again. One guy who works for a big mining company went to Papua New Guinea on his first day of work and saw the extent of domestic violence there, and was trying to think about, well, what role could or should or does the company play? Are we exacerbating it? How can we make it better? And I thought, and I said to him, wasn't that incredibly overwhelming and disheartening to see that this is what you were stepping into? And he said, I thought this was an opportunity to do really good human rights work, that this is a place where we could actually make a difference. So yeah, it's incredibly disheartening, but what are you going to do about it? Are you going to do nothing? Like, we've all got to do something, and it's just what is ours to do.
And different people have different roles. I mean, I think even within the NGO community, it was interesting. I was talking to somebody from Greenpeace the other day, and he was saying, well, we pave the way for the NGOs who are going to work with companies by giving them the agenda to do that. So it makes it easier for us to show up at the door when Greenpeace has been out there hammering away. So I think there is this sort of ecosystem of of forces that will shift companies. But I think we had yes, that's right, another question there.
Thank you so much for being here. So one thing that really struck me about your book was sort of this feeling of being isolated as a corporate idealist in a massive company.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you could speak about creating a culture of accountability in a huge company such as Google or BP. It's the supply chain is just so massive. Yeah. And so for the Gap example that you presented about the subcontractor hiring these laborers as opposed to the corporate heads at Gap saying let's hire. Yeah. How do you manage for accountability in these huge supply chains? And also, if you could speak about your experience at BP or elsewhere, just creating that culture of accountability among people.
And by that, do you mean a culture of taking responsibility for those issues that previously somebody might have said that's not our
right, and let's push this off to the subcontractors because it's no longer in our hands. Yeah,
that's a great question. Let me think to my own experience. I mean, I guess so. In China, it was about trying to make the case that we are accountable for those issues, whether we like it or not. And I think that's been a big theme in this field for a long time of companies. Every company is sort of going through this journey, and it's like the 7 stages of grieving, right? Or that first there's this denial, right? And we saw this with Nike, with sweatshops, and we saw it with Shell in Nigeria. And we even saw it, I think, with censorship when the first wave sort of hit this industry and these cases coming to the fore of companies saying, not my responsibility, that's somebody else's responsibility. And then I think realizing it's like, that's not good enough, and whether or not legally this is your responsibility, the court of public opinion believes that it's your responsibility. So I think a lot of companies started taking responsibility because they realized, like, well, I guess it is now. So I think there are a few factors that make that happen. One of them is external pressure, right? And so we saw this with Apple, right? When the big New York Times expose came out about working conditions in Foxconn factories, and at first Apple sort of demurred. I mean, they've been working on supply chain responsibility for a long time. This wasn't new, but we really saw them step up after there was so much public pressure and join the Fair Labor Association, which is a big deal for Apple in particular, right? To have third-party auditors come in and inspect their supplier factories. And actually for Google to join the Global Network Initiative, that's a huge step because that requires third-party auditors to come in and look at your processes. And you guys know better than anybody. I mean, do you let anybody in here to poke around and look at stuff? Like, that's actually a big deal. But I think that your company's leadership realized, because of what enough of you were saying also inside the company, of like, hey, we need to step up our game here. If we're really going to live out our values and take responsibility for what we're doing and be the most trusted company for people, this is what we need to do. So again, I think in every company, there are going to be sort of different drivers and pressures that will create that culture. But I think in all of those cases, a lot of it will come from within, of people saying, folks, this is simply what we need to do. But I think it's different in every company.
And I think there are a lot of extra. I mean, there's a wide. I mean, shareholders for a start are starting. In some cases, starting to push the companies that they own into disclosure. And then you have you know, the power of a company like Walmart that can say, well, look here, suppliers, you've all got to meet certain environmental standards if you're actually going to sell to us.
Yeah.
So I think there's a range of pressures, but you're right. I mean,
Yeah.
the internal one is a very important one as well.
Yeah.
I think we might have time for one more.
One more question.
If there is one.
If there is one.
Okay, well, I just want to thank Christine and Sarah so much for coming to speak with us today. This was a great conversation and lots of issues that Google's thinking about too in a very different context. So interesting to hear all of those perspectives. So thank you again. I
Thank
really
you.
appreciate it.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.